Hello and welcome to our critical thinking course. Today we're looking at chapters 2 and 3. So, chapter 2 expands on the relation of emotion and reason. Importantly, emotion is defined as all the various feelings and inclinations, from hunger and anger to fear, anxiety, love, and so on. This tells us something important. Emotions are the default setting in the body, and they're intimately tied to the body. Reason, on the other hand, seems to be something for which we have an inborn potential, but it is not a default setting for our behavior. These two features are competing for our attention, for the driver's seat, so to speak, and emotion is always a driver by default. This is because emotion is the default setting, the original operating system. As a simple example, no one has to teach you to be hungry, but we do have to teach people how to exercise moderation. So, in order for reason to work, we have to eject emotion and put reason in driver's seat by force. But emotion is not willing to just sit by, so really, even when reason is in the driver's seat, emotion keeps on trying to grab the wheel. And this is why your body keeps trying to get you to cheat on your diet or to be too lazy to go back to the gym, and so on. Now, at this point, a lot of people like to interject that we need emotions in order to make certain kinds of decisions. For example, when something bad happens, we need to act quickly. Or, if someone is hurting, let's say emotionally, we need empathy, and so on. And to this, I think we can respond by asking some questions. If you get into a car crash and then see your child bleeding profusely in the seat, what should you do? You emotionally feel like panicking, freaking out, and so on, but rationally, you should call 911, check their breathing, and then apply pressure to the wound, and so on. And how exactly should you show empathy when someone is hurting? And should you show it in the exact same way towards everyone? If your significant other lost a parent, you're going to approach that show of empathy differently than if it's your gaming buddy. So how do you distinguish between the two? And this is what people tend to confuse. When we say that reason is in the driver's seat, we don't mean that emotions don't exist. We mean that the final decision on what to do and how, and what not to do, should not be blindly emotional. Instead, you have to run the emotion through a rational filter and decide whether to act on it or not. The conversation about reaction and response in the chapter is just an explanation of that process. Default behavior, emotion in the driver's seat, is a reaction. You just lash out, driven by whatever emotion is currently strongest. Responses are what we get when we eject emotion and push reason forward. Notice that at no point can we actually get rid of emotion. It is always there. All we can do, and arguably what we should do, is control it so it does not drive us off a cliff. Now finally, to reiterate, the unreliability of emotions comes from the fact that all the terrible things that people do, and all the wonderful things, can all be inspired by emotion. But how do we distinguish which emotion is good and which is bad? Which should we act on and which should we not? Because emotions are on both sides of the problem, you can't use emotion to work out the answer to that question, right? Because it is ultimately emotion that is getting us into trouble to begin with. And so we need something that is not an emotion, which will regulate which emotions do come through and which are checked. And that something else is always reason. Now, obviously, we do need emotions to tell us to do stuff like eat, drink, and be afraid of bears, and so on. The trick is, you can't let it make that final decision. That is the proper role of reason. And I'm sure you've all at least seen bad relationships that people get themselves into and stay in because of emotions, while you, because you are not burdened by the stress of emotions, can clearly see that it's a bad idea and is doomed to fail. In Chapter 3, we take a look at a major cause of moral confusion, namely misunderstanding whether an idea is based on moral or functional bases. But first, why? Why bother with this? Well, when we hear things that are morally triggering, we tend to stop thinking, and that's because we reject the idea viscerally, and that's all there is to it. For example, most of you may have reacted to the what's wrong with rape example in the book. The trouble is, there are several deep problems that arise from this approach. First, whenever we stop thinking, we have switched over to the emotional mode, and that's no good. Second, all too often, we don't actually understand what the point is, and by not listening, we are failing to actually understand what's going on. Third, even if the other side is dead wrong, we can still learn a lot, including how they got there and what mistakes led to that idea, but we can only do this by actually engaging with the idea. And finally, there is certainly a good chance that our own ideas are wrong, and so not listening and thinking means that we remain in the wrong. Part of getting this right means that we have to revise our own standard ways of thinking, so that when we hear a claim, we don't just react emotionally, pushed by our moral outrage. For one thing, that gets us nowhere useful, and for another, since we're not actually able to have a discussion or explore issues, we end up significantly dumber than we should be. When we are able to meaningfully distinguish between moral and functional claims, we are far better equipped to look for truth and can actually address the claim itself. Now, part of our problem here comes from the fact that we assume that things that we like are good and that things that we don't like are bad. That means that we're actually assuming that our preferences are a reliable indicator of reality, and that's simply not the case. How many times has it turned out that what a person desires is bad for them? Well, we can take a look at all the various alcoholics and drug addicts and people who've gotten into all sorts of other messes chasing things that they like. And how many times has it turned out that what a person dislikes is good for them? Like working out. It sucks, but it is better for you. Controlling your appetite is unpleasant, but you get to avoid type 2 diabetes. So this is an important feature in general thinking. We like to assume that we are right, because if we are not right, then we have to change our ideas and behaviors. And the way we have to change them is from doing what we prefer to do to something that we prefer not to do. So we don't want to listen. And what's additionally interesting is that we have no problem picking out what's actually correct and what's not when we're looking at other people. Now, when we ask meaningful kinds of questions and engage with meaningful claims and discussions, part of what we're doing is checking whether we might be very wrong ourselves. If you think about yourself 10 or 20 years ago, what ideas did you have then that you don't have today? And what exactly happened in between? To quote Muhammad Ali, the man who views the world at 50 the same as he did at 20 has wasted 30 years of his life. But that means that some of our ideas today must also be wrong. And that means that at least some of the ideas that we strongly oppose today may actually be right, meaning that we will come to that conclusion in time. So at least occasionally we have bad ideas because we didn't understand the original idea very well. Maybe we weren't paying attention, maybe it just didn't click, and so on. For example, lots of people assume that the Freedom of Religion clause in the First Amendment is supposed to protect the state from the church. It is, in fact, the other way around. The point of that part of the amendment is to prevent the state from getting into religion. And the reason why that exists is because this had happened all across Europe during the Reformation and caused about 150 years of brutal wars. And the great variety of authors that the Founding Fathers are quoting, people like John Locke, are writing specifically to prevent that sort of breakout of violence from happening. And that violence had nothing to do with the church trying to take over the state, but with the state trying to take over the church. Now, all that is to say that our immediate moral shock at an idea is something that we have to learn to control. We can't afford to ignore or dismiss ideas because we don't like them or because they're not popular. Instead, we have to treat ideas with equal respect. Now, once you have fully understood an idea, And if you can find weak points in it, then feel free to tear it apart. But the thing is, you can't really find weak points unless you first study the idea carefully. Now with that, if you have questions, comments, concerns, feel free to leave it in the comments and share, subscribe, and all the rest of the good things.